Okay, welcome everybody. Good evening. I'll briefly introduce myself. My name is Pieter van den Heede. I'm a PhD student at the Erasmus University in Rotterdam, and I'm actually in the process of finishing up my dissertation on World War II games. So what I will be talking about is drawn from the dissertation and partly an extension from it. Okay, so what I want to do during this brief note is basically address the following central question. How can we use digital games to promote critical historical reflection on the Holocaust? That's my key focal point. And to do so, I want to partly connect to what has been said before, but I want to add a dimension to that. So for example, Kate Marison already talked about Call of Duty World War II and how it represents the Holocaust or tries to do so. There's the epilogue scene. I added some screenshots here. Now, I don't want to talk about the game itself. I think a lot of the criticisms that were presented are absolutely true and valuable. Call of Duty very much presents a nationalistic, militaristic, patriotic interpretation of what the Holocaust is in light of dominant hegemonic American memory about the Second World War. What I want to emphasize, though, is how players respond to it, because this is something that I also partly did in my dissertation. Part of my work was to carry out a focus group study where I talked to people who played Call of Duty World War II, who played the single player, so the story mode, and also went through the camp. What I wanted to do is ask them about their experiences. And so one of the things that stood out for me while doing the study is that a lot of players actually experienced it in a very positive sense. They very much identified it as a source for historical engagement and historical understanding. So just to give you a couple of quotes from my focus groups, it's just one, just to keep it brief. When I asked them, what do you think about the scene? Well, then we get stuff like this. Oh, I think this very much shows the reality. It gives me an idea of what the camps look like. It also gives me an idea of what those American soldiers must have experienced when they entered those camps in the final days of the war. So there's this one sense that players derive an understanding of the history of the Second World War from playing these games. The second element is also the interactivity specifically. That is also something that they very much would emphasize. If I ask them whether or not being able to walk through the camp, albeit in a very limited sense, being able to do that was identified as something positive and meaningful for them, because players could then explore certain sites or certain parts of the camp that would not have been able to do so if there would have been a fixed route. So basically what I want to highlight is, even though we can critique Call of Duty World War II in a lot of significant ways and a lot of meaningful ways, we do have to take serious the notion that for a lot of players, it's also very much a meaningful way of engaging with the past, with the Second World War. Basically, based on this core observation, what I want to introduce more broadly, more generally, when it comes to historical games, and so also engagement with the Holocaust through gaming, is that games can allow for what I would call moments of historical revelation. The idea that people, while playing a game, can emergently, experientially, while playing the game, gain a certain understanding of what the past is. Now, whether or not that's a productive or a counterproductive understanding, that's something that I want to leave in the middle. I want to use historical revelation as a broad notion to describe experiences that players can have. Now, based on that core observation, I would then say, coming back to my central question, well, how do we allow for productive engagements with the Holocaust through gaming? Also specifically in light of perhaps people from memorial institutions who might be attending the session. My approach would be that we have to start thinking about types of design, types of game design that allow for meaningful ways of historical revelation. Now, I wanted to keep the brief short, but I can expand on a little bit. What are some examples of historical revelation that I would be thinking of? Let me start with the second one, investigative historical engagement. This is basically what I think you already see in Call of Duty World War II, players being able to explore the camp at least to a significant, well, to a little extent. They can go and look at certain parts of the camp. I think that Call of Duty does that in a very limited sense. There's very little to explore. So one core approach I think, to expand on that, is to expand the investigative potential of a certain segment of a game. Add additional materials to it so that players can, engage in inquiry themselves while playing. I think that's a very productive way of letting them gain a further understanding of the past. Now, the other approach, the first one, is a more specific one, and I briefly want to elaborate on it too, which is, I would say, experiences of liminality during wartime. Now, what I mean by that is, and I'm going to skip a couple of slides because I added some additional materials in it, so indulge me for a little bit. Boom, boom, here we go. Okay, what I mean by that, when I talk about liminality during wartime, here I basically want to draw a connection to a trend that we've seen in World War II and Holocaust historiography over the past few years. If we go back to the 90s, right, or even further to like many years ago, the 60s even, then we can think about an author like Raoul Hilberg, who at a certain point introduced the book Perpetrators, Victims, and Bystanders, in which he talked about categories of people, how you could characterize their behavior during the Second World War. Now, a couple of years ago, this book was published by historians Frank Bayot and Andrea Leu, The Holocaust in European Societies, in which they present the following argument. Actually, it's better to let go of these rigid categories of perpetrator, victim, bystander, because if you look at the behavior of a lot of people during the war, there's an element of dynamic. There's a dynamic to it. People's positions could change from moment to moment. They were seldom fixed. So basically, what we see is that categories like perpetratorship, victimhood, bystandership are imposing certain straitjackets, very rigid categories on behavior that is actually very dynamic. Now, if I then come back to productive forms of historical revelation, then I would think that certainly games, and I think I here certainly want to connect to some of the things that Wolf Kannsteiner was also talking about. I would say that games like Papers, Please, for example, have the potential, they carry it within themselves, to introduce an element of dynamism to how we can think about bystandership, victimhood, and perpetratorship. In this game, you play as an immigration officer at a border post in a communist country, in an Eastern Bloc country. And basically what you have to do is you have to decide whether or not to let people in. But these choices are not clear cut and open. You have to let people in correctly. You have to assess the papers of people traveling across the border to earn money. But at the same time, you will be challenged with a lot of ethical dilemmas that you have to solve. And you also have to do this in light of a communist regime, which can punish you without legal protection or anything like that. So what I would say, and I can expand on it a little bit further later on, but I would say that a game like this introduces this element of dynamic to how we can think about categories like perpetratorship, victimhood, and bystandership. Okay, that's that. A final notion that I want to introduce quickly here is this. So historical revelation, games that allow for these moments. I would also say this is also a very good element that I think is important for historical games, that we also add additional materials to it. One of the things that I thought was a bit weak about Call of Duty World War II is, well, a lot of things, but when you go through the camp, you have the camp section itself, but there's nothing surrounding it. There's no materials that you can consult, like a menu button where you can read something more. I think that a very productive approach for creating games about sensitive topics like this is to create ludic engagement itself, but also add materials to it that people can consult after they have experienced something through play. Here, I want to make a broader observation, and it's a bit of a guess. It's something that was inspired by what Wolf Kannsteiner was talking about. How do we have to think about awareness in terms of digital memory? I think that what a hypertext form like a game allows for is an element of cyberneticness. What I mean by that is think about how air conditioning regulates itself, right? It dynamically adjusts itself. Well, when we talk about hypertext and digital culture, we always have the ability to click on a new link, engage with more information and more information. I think that when we create games, that we have to embrace this hypertext potential to move towards a cybernetic awareness, where we constantly try to update our understanding of the past. Basically, we adopt a continued investigative mode of engaging with the past. And by adding these contextual materials to your game, you can actually already add that hypertext potential to the ludic experience itself. I want to perhaps end with a quote by a Dutch historian, Pieter Geil. History is a never-ending conversation. I think that if we use digital games as a hypertext format to, capitalize on that, I think we can certainly make that happen through games like the ones I talked about. So that would be my contribution, but I'm curious to hear what other people think about this take.